All right, today we're diving into the story of an institution that was really a pillar of Washington, D.C.'s African-American community for over 100 years. We're talking about the National Home for Destitute Colored Women and Children, which you might know as the Merriweather Home. And it's a powerful story for sure, one about crisis, resilience, and honestly, a pretty complicated legacy.
So this was its founding mission. Just listen to that language. An asylum for the freed orphans and destitute aged women. Wow. That one single sentence just perfectly captures the huge, and I mean huge, humanitarian crisis that was happening in the nation's capital during the Civil War. You had thousands of people seeking freedom, but they were arriving with absolutely nothing.
And it all officially kicked off right here in 1863. Specifically, on February 14th of that year, an act of Congress incorporated the National Association for the Relief of Destitute Colored Women and Children. This wasn't just some small charity, it had a legal foundation to do this incredibly vital work.
So to really get why this home was so important, we've got to start with the crisis that made it an absolute necessity in the first place. And the historical sources, they really paint a grim picture. Just imagine, people are escaping slavery. They're fleeing to Washington, D.C., seeking freedom, right? But they get there, and the city is completely unprepared. We're talking no money, no resources, and often no family to turn to. The conditions were just so awful that one source actually estimates a third of these freedom seekers died in just a 4-year period. A third. That's staggering.
So, where did they go? Well, a lot of them ended up in these places called contraband camps. That was the government's term. And these places, they were crowded, they didn't have basic necessities, and if you were an orphan child or an elderly woman who couldn't find work, survival was a constant daily struggle. This is the world that the National Home was born into.
You know, the home's physical journey really tells a story all on its own. It's kind of crazy, but it didn't have a stable, permanent location for its first 70 years. Can you imagine? It started out at this confiscated estate, and then it was forced to move to a different neighborhood, and then, finally, in 1930, it settled on Euclid Street. All that movement just goes to show you how precarious its existence really was.
Okay, so next up, let's look at how this place managed to survive and evolve, especially because it was increasingly run by the very same community it was built to serve.
So the core challenge here was systemic. It was deeply baked into the city. See, civic charity in Washington was segregated, and the documents are super clear about this. On one side, you had white orphanages getting more government money and way more private donations. On the other side, you have the National Home, which was just constantly battling budget deficits with what one historian called restricted resources. It was a tale of two completely different systems.
Now, what's really interesting is that even though the association was founded by wealthy white individuals, it had major black leadership from very, very early on. We're talking by the 1870s. You had absolute giants like Frederick Douglass, the successful hotel owner James Wormley, and Dr. Charles Purvis. All of them were serving as trustees. That's a huge deal.
And all of this brings us to a really pivotal leader, a woman whose name would eventually become completely synonymous with the home itself.
So let's meet Mary Louise Robinson Merriweather. I mean, what a remarkable person. She was born in Ohio to a prominent family, and get this, she was one of the very first African-American graduates of Oberlin College. She then moves to D.C., works as a teacher, and marries a successful lawyer who becomes one of the wealthiest black men in the city. So we're talking about a highly educated, super influential woman who decided to dedicate her life to this home.
And her impact? Oh, it was felt long before she ever officially took the helm. Back in 1892, years before she became president, her advocacy was credited with literally saving the institution. Its federal funding was on the line, and she stepped in. It's clear she was an absolute force from the very beginning.
All right, let's dive into the home's final chapter, its last decades at the Euclid Street location, and what ultimately became of its century-long mission.
Okay, check out this map from 1887. This shows us the home's footprint in the Pleasant Plains neighborhood. You can see it right there. It's occupying this huge plot of land, and this is where it served the community for more than 60 years before it had to make its final move.
Now, even after moving into a smaller building on Euclid Street, the people running it worked so hard to create a warm environment. There's a newspaper article from 1963 celebrating its 100th anniversary, and it paints this beautiful picture, not of some cold, sterile institution, but of a true home. It describes it as being filled with sunlight, plants, and all these personal touches.
The 20th century, though, brought some pretty big changes. First, the home narrowed its focus to care only for children. Then, in the 1950s, it was officially renamed to honor its greatest champion, Mary L. Merriweather. It seemed like it was set for the future. But then, 1971. After more than a century of continuous operation, it all just came to a sudden, shocking end.
And the ending really is tragic. I mean, think about it. This is the same institution that survived the Civil War, that survived decades of chronic underfunding, that survived multiple forced relocations, and it was shut down by a court order. The reasons cited were incredibly severe: inhumane conditions and being nearly bankrupt. Just a shocking, heartbreaking end to such a long history of service.
So, what's left? What remains of an institution that housed and cared for thousands of women and children over more than 100 years?
Well, the physical building at 733 Euclid Street actually lived on. First, it became a daycare center, and then later a really vibrant community arts collective. And then, in 2022, in recognition of its incredibly deep history, the building was officially designated a historic landmark and put on the National Register. It's like the last physical piece of the home story is finally being preserved.
In that historic designation really gets to the heart of why this whole story matters so much. See, the Merriweather Home was unique. At a time of just deep segregation and systemic neglect, this was an institution built for the Black community and more over time run by the Black community. It's just this incredibly powerful story of perseverance and self-reliance.
But you know, it's also really important that we acknowledge what we don't know. The historical records, they have gaps. Sources actually disagree on the exact year Mary Merriweather even became president. The spelling of her name changes from document to document. And maybe most importantly, the individual stories, the voices and experiences of the thousands of women and children who actually lived there, those are almost entirely lost to history.
And so that really leaves us with this question, doesn't it? The preservation of the building, it ensures the Merriweather Home isn't just forgotten. It's still there, a physical reminder of a century of struggle and care. And it kind of forces us to ask, how do we remember these complicated histories and all of the thousands of lives that they touched?